Hi, welcome to this week's Word for Wednesday. And today I was thinking I want to share something that's been on my mind a bit lately, and that is the idea of Christian simplicity. Christian simplicity. Now, what do I mean by that? Glad you asked. Well, Jesus lived in a very complex world. There was a lot of political turmoil, political complexity with Romans ruling over everything and often ruling through puppets that they installed, while at the same time, Jews had their leaders that they preferred, and all of them jockeying for who gets how much power. And then there were religious considerations as well. And in Jesus' time, of course, we're all aware of the Pharisees who were predominant in the countryside where Jesus did much of his ministry. But as we get closer to Jerusalem, you see a group called the Sadducees, and those are just two of the many religious groups going on at that time. And into this scene steps Jesus Christ. You would think, okay, well, Jesus, you know, Christians follow Jesus, so you think he's adding another complication to what is already a very complicated situation. And what we find is that's not actually the case. What we see Jesus doing and that his disciples proceed to do after his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension is that they find ways to cut through the complexity. They cut through the complexity and boil things down to the most simple terms that they can. It started with Jesus, and it's carried on by Paul and Peter and the other apostles as they go forward preaching a gospel of grace. Well, what are some of the complications that Jesus had to cut through? Well, at the time, with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they debated a lot about how best to interpret the Old Testament. And our most famous examples are the Sadducees, not the Sadducees, the Pharisees, who were very concentrated on the Old Testament law. They boiled things down to a science and identifying the laws of the Old Testament and dividing those laws and how they should apply them. What they did was, I got some notes here. In the Old Testament, they identified 613 laws. They then proceed to divide those laws into 248 affirmative laws, things that were commanded to do. So, of 613 Old Testament laws, we have 248 of them are affirmative laws, and then 365 are negative laws, things that we are commanded not to do. So, if that isn't complicated enough, the Pharisees, through oral tradition, proceed to preach and teach 1,500 additional laws surrounding those 613 laws. Now, what do I mean by 1,500 that are surrounding those 613 laws? Here's what I mean by that. The best way I can describe it is an example. I grew up in the suburbs of the city of Grand Rapids, and as my friends and I were romping around the neighborhood while we were kids, we'd come across these power transformers, I think they're called, big metal structures, bunch of power lines feeding into them and running out of them. And of course, around these power transformers were tall chain link fences with barbed wire at the top and signs on them that read high voltage, keep out. All right, now, so that's good, all well and good. So the best way to look at it is the Old Testament laws, the 613, I think, yeah, 613 laws of the Old Testament are those signs around the power transformer saying keep out. Well, what the Pharisees then proceeded to do was put a fence around those fences and put on them keep out. So these additional laws that they're coming up with are additional fences around the fences that are already in existence. And they're treating those additional fences, the man made fences, with the same authority as they treat the original fence or the God-made fence. So they're coming up with all kinds of rules and regulations to apply to their lives. And what does Jesus come do? He comes along and cuts through all the complication. He does it with the Pharisees most famously, but he also does it with the Sadducees. In one example, I got here Matthew chapter 22. He has a confrontation with the Sadducees first and then the Pharisees after. We're going to focus on his confrontation with the Pharisees afterwards, after the Sadducees, where they come and they try to trap him by asking him, what is the greatest commandment? They say in Matthew 22, verse 36, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said to them, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Jesus cuts right through all the complication and simplifies it to two commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. On those two things hinge everything else. And I've been thinking about this lately as I've been thinking about Christian simplicity and how simple the Christian faith is. It's faith in Jesus Christ. If you shall confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus Christ and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. A simple matter of faith. And how often do we as Christians like to overcomplicate things, just like the ancient Pharisees and Sadducees did? We like to complicate things by diving into the Old Testament and trying to reapply all the Old Testament laws to us today. Or we like to come up with man-made rules and regulations about thou shalt and thou shalt not in order to apply those to our Christian lives. And why do we do that? Well, I think part of it is human nature, where we apply more rules that we can uphold, and it gives us a sense of power and a sense of ownership over our own salvation. And I think part of it is we like to look at these laws, apply them to our lives, and pat ourselves on the back for how good we are that we uphold these laws, and how superior we are to everyone else who doesn't uphold those laws. And all of those are contrary to the Christian message. The simple Christian message of salvation by grace through faith. Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace are you saved through faith, that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So keep in mind, as you're going through this week, the idea of Christian simplicity. Let's not overcomplicate things. When we do so, we do a disservice to ourselves, and we do a disservice to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks for joining me on this Word for Wednesday. This is a ministry of Lakefield Baptist Church in McMillan, Michigan. If you're in McMillan or the area of Newberry, Michigan, you don't have a church to go to on Sunday mornings, you're welcome to join us here at 11 o'clock. Thanks. We'll see you next time.